Hey there, if you want to learn how to integrate generative AI into your web applications, this video will teach you everything you need to know. For this project, we are going to be using the Gemini API from Google AI, and we're going to build the whole thing using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript only. The cool thing here is that our bot is not going to be giving generic answers. We are going to train the model with real business data, which means that once you have it set up, you can use it for any use case of your own. You just have to swap the training data, and this is going to be a fully functioning chatbot assistant. This is also a great project for you to post on LinkedIn so you can showcase your skills in generative AI. If you want, you can tag me there and I will leave a comment to help boost your post. Alright, so let's dive into building this AI chatbot assistant using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For those of you who like starting projects from the absolute beginning, in this video, we are going to be working on the HTML and CSS parts of the chat assistant. If you want to skip this part and go straight to JavaScript and Google AI, you can find in the description of this video the version of the project with the HTML and CSS ready. Then you can just jump to the next chapter of this video. If you want to follow along with me in the HTML and CSS parts, let's start by creating a new folder for this project. Let's name this 2-chat assistant. Now go into Visual Studio Code, let's open this folder, and let's create the index.html file with the basic structure. Let's add the link to the CSS file and create the style.css file and do the same thing for the JavaScript file. Now we can click Go Live to start the local server, and now we can start working on the project. Now inside the body element, let's create a new element for the chat window. Inside here, we're going to have three sections. We're going to have the close button. So let's add a button with a class of close. I'm going to write X close on it. We're also going to have a section for the chat. So div.chat. Now here we are going to have messages sent by the model and messages sent by the user. So let's start with one example of a message sent by the model. We can type something like, "Hi, how can I help you?" Now apart from this, we also need the input area so user can send messages. So let's start a new div with a class of input area. And inside, we are going to have an input. Let's add a placeholder for it. Let's type something like ask me anything. And we also need a button so we can send the message. Let's save it. And now we have the basic structure for the chat. Now let's go to the CSS file and open a new selector for the chat window. I'm going to add a border just so we can see the behavior of this element better. And the first thing I'm going to do is set its position to absolute so it can appear in front of everything else on the page. And we are going to position it at the bottom right of the screen like most chat assistants. So bottom, let's add it at a distance of maybe 60 pixels and 20 pixels to the right. All right, now let's add fixed dimensions so it looks more like a chat window. So let's say height 600 and width 360. So this is the structure of our chat window. Now let's position these elements correctly. So I'm going to create a selector for the close button. So inside we have a button called close. I'm going to add border none. Let's add some paddings to top and bottom. And I want it to grow with its parent. So let's use flex for this. I'm going to set the display of flex to the chat window. Let's change the direction. So flex direction column. Now let's add a justify content of space between. So this is the structure we are going to want for this. Close button at the top, input section at the bottom, and the chat covering the middle part. So let's add a selector for the chat section. I'm going to add some background colors here just so we have a better visibility of the elements. Later, we can remove them. So we can see that this is just a small section in the middle. We're going to fix that in a moment. Let me also add a selector for the input area. Now for this, let me add a fixed height of 70 pixels. And to make the chat grow and take the rest of the space, we are going to set its flex property to 1. Alright, so now the positions are correct. Let's work on the alignment for the input area. So for this, I'm going to set its display to flex. Let's add the justify content property to center and also the align items property to center. And we can set fixed heights for both the input and the button. So height 40 pixels. Same thing for the button. Let's change its border to none. Let's add some margin to the left side. 12 pixels should be fine. Then we can make the input take the rest of the space and add some paddings to the right and left sides of the parent. So 0 top and bottom and 8 pixels on the sides. Okay, now let's adjust some colors. For the close section, I'm going to add a background color of 1A, 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 which is a dark gray, and the color to white. Now we can remove the background color for the chat and for the input area. And to separate these two sections, I'm going to add a border top to the input area to 1 pixel solid light gray. Now let's create some variables for colors we are going to reuse inside here. So I'm going to add the root pseudo element. So I'm going to create a variable called gray for a tone of gray that I'm going to use a couple of times here. And this is going to be F5, 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 and also one called blue. And this is going to be 3D 88 F9. Now down here, let's remember we have an element called chat, and inside we have a div with a class of model, which is going to be the messages sent by the system. Inside we have a P element. So for this one, I'm going to set the background color to the gray variable I just created. Now we can see it showing there. Let's add some paddings. 16 pixels to all sides is going to look better. Now let's remember that we have paddings on the sides for the input area. So let's do the same thing for the chat area. So we can have things lined up. So like this, we have the messages lined up with the input field. Now let's add a user message here so we can have different styles for it. I'm going to add one user. Let's type something like, I need help with an order, and another model message just so we can see how this is going to look. So please give me the order number. This is just for the first example. Now going back there, let's copy the whole thing, but change the class to user. And for the background color, I'm going to choose blue instead and the color of white. Let's also add some border radius so this looks nicer. And for that, I'm going to add to all the P's. So let's add a new selector at the top here so we can apply a border radius of 20 pixels to all the P's inside this element. Now, this is starting to look much better. Let's just line things up a bit better so we can differentiate these messages more easily. And for that, I'm going to add a width of 80% to the piece. And for the user message, I'm going to add a display of flex and a justify content of flex end. Now the margins are a bit too big, so let's reset them to 8 pixels top and bottom and 0 to the sides. All right, this is starting to look much better. So let's go to the input area. I'm going to remove the border from the input. And instead, I'm going to use a background color of that same gray color. Let's add the same border radius of 20 pixels to this element and a padding left of 20 pixels. And for the button, I'm going to add a background color of blue, color to white, and let's add the width at 40 pixels as well. So we have a square button. Now we can set the border radius this time to 100%, so we have it completely round. In order to centralize things inside, we can add a display of flex, justify content center, and align items center. Now instead of showing that send text, let's use an image. Now you can go ahead and download the send icon that I left in the description of this video and save it inside your projects folder. So here we have send icon.png. If we go back to Visual Studio Code, we can see the image showing in the file explorer. So going to the HTML, instead of having send, we are going to include an image linked to send icon.png. We do this, it's super big at the moment, so let's go back there. Let's add a selector for the image inside the button, and let's set its width to maybe 20 pixels. Let's see how this looks. Maybe a bit smaller. Let's try 18. Now I think this looks perfect. Now we're almost done. Let me just make the borders of this chat a bit smoother. So scrolling to the top, right here where we have the chat window, let me remove the border. And let's look for CSS box shadow options. We have this website that has 95 beautiful CSS box shadow examples. I think this is a nice resource for this. So we can just pick one. I think number 5 for this example is going to look great. So I'm going to click here to copy the CSS code. We can close this and let's add the box shadow instead. Now this is much better. Now to make this even smoother, let's add some rounded corners. So border radius 20 pixels. Now we need to do the same thing for the close button so we can see it at the top. So inside close, we are going to add border radius 20 pixels. We can see it at the top, but we don't want it at the bottom of the button. So we are going to add it to top, left, and right. And for the bottom, we are going to leave it at 0 for both. All right, now this is much better. Now let's see if the scrolling behavior is correct. So going back to the HTML file, I'm just going to copy these messages and I'm going to paste them a few times just so we can see how this is going to look when the chat gets bigger. So let's paste this maybe 3 more times. We're going to delete this when we're done with the CSS. So we can save this and we can see that this is not behaving correctly. This is overflowing the element. So we need to go back there, and for the chat area, if we set the overflow to hidden, we can see that the messages are not showing. This is not what we want. We want the overflow to be scroll. Well, let's do this only for the y-axis. So for the y-axis, the default behavior is going to be scroll. Now, this is exactly the way we need it to be. All right, we can go back there and remove these extra messages. Let me just add one user message here, just so we can see one of each. All right, now one last thing for us to finish is to add a nice font. For this project, I think one font called Railway is going to look great. So let's click Get Font. Let's get the embed code, paste this inside the HTML. Right at the top before the link to the CSS file, we can paste all this, and let's get the font family line, and we can set it to all elements inside the chat window. Now let me just make sure that both the messages and the input have the same sizes. So let me add a font size for the piece of 16 pixels and the same for the input. Now it seems that the font family hasn't been applied to the input. So let me just go up here, and instead of adding to the parent element like this, we can set it to all elements inside with the global selector. Now we can save this, and now this is being applied to the input as well. So this is pretty cool. Now we have the chat window ready. One thing we need to work on is the functionality to close this chat window, but for that, we also need a button so we can open it up. Let's leave that for later, and let's focus on the functionality of the chat. So right here, let's go back to the HTML file. Let's remember that we added this message just so we could test how the chat would look when it got bigger. Now we can delete this message because we're only going to start with how can I help you, and the rest is going to be the real chat interaction. Now here we have an input and we have a send button, so everything will start once the user sends the message. So I'm going to go to the JavaScript file and I'm going to create a new function called send message. To get started, let me just send an alert, and I'm going to get whatever we can find in that input field. So first, let's create a variable. I'm going to call it user message, and this is going to get document.querySelector. Let's remember that here we have the chat window, input area, and input. To make things easier, since we only have one input, I'm just going to use chat window and input. So chat window space input. Then we are going to get the value of this input field. Now once we do it, we can send an alert just to see if this is working. Now we need this function to be fired when we click that button. So let's go to the HTML file. First, I'm going to do something from the HTML code, but this is not going to be the actual implementation, and I'm going to explain why in a second. But first, let's add the onClick here. Now here we can execute the send message function. We save this. Let's send something like hello. Click the button. And now we can see that we are firing that function and we have access to the user message. Now what I was trying to explain is the following. To work with Google AI, we are going to have to import the functions from Google AI, which means that the type of our script is going to have to be module. We save this, and now if we try again, this is not going to work. I'm clicking the button and I'm seeing nothing. So let me go to the inspector, and we can see that send message is not defined. How come if we just tested and it was working correctly? The problem here is that when we use type module, the functions that we create here are not global, which means we don't have access to these functions from the HTML code. But this is not a problem. We just have to take a different approach and set the event handler from the JavaScript file instead of from the HTML code. So here we are not going to fire it from here. Instead, we are going to select a button inside the input area. So let me just copy this part of the code. So here we have chat window. This time we have another button, which is the close button. So let me be more specific here. And let's go inside the input area. There's a button inside. And then we are going to add an event listener. We are going to listen to clicks. And once there's a click, we are going to execute a function, which is going to be send message. I'm just going to break a line here so we can see this better. So pay attention if you haven't missed any closing parentheses or anything. We can now save this. If we go back to the HTML, we don't have that onClick here anymore. And now we can try sending a message, saying hello, click the button, and we can see that now this is working. So I just wanted to call your attention to the event listener when you are working with a JavaScript file of type module. This is cool, but let's do a little test here. If we send a blank message, we're going to be firing the function anyway. So let's create a conditional so we only do something if we have anything to send. We don't have to alert the user, but we can just bypass the function. So here we created a variable for the user message, and we can start a conditional here that if user message.length, let's remember that strings have a length, which is the number of characters. So if this is greater than 0, then we are going to go ahead and do something with the message. If not, we're just not going to do anything. So we save this. If we try to press the button, nothing will happen until we actually type something. So we can see the message right here. Now we need to do 3 things inside here. We are not going to send alerts. What we are going to do is the following. First, we are going to delete the message from the input. So we are going to select this input again. And we are going to set its value to an empty string back. Apart from that, we are also going to add the user message to the history of the chat. So let's remember that this is how the messages should appear, with the difference that the class is going to be user instead. So let me copy this. And we are inside chat window, chat. So going back there, we're going to do document.query selector. So we are inside chat window, space, chat. Don't forget the dots. I forgot both of them, so let me put it right now. And I'm going to invoke a method called insert adjacent HTML, so we can add that message. In a real-life application, I would create a separate function and use the create element method instead, just to be safer. Remember that inserting HTML directly via JavaScript can be unsafe in some situations. In this case, just for the sake of this example, I'm going to use this method. So this method has 2 arguments. First, we need to decide where we are going to insert the HTML. In this case, this is going to be before end. And then the HTML code we want to insert, which I'm going to add inside backticks. So let me paste that HTML code inside. The difference is that this is going to be a user message, and inside the P, we can use $, curly braces, and we can paste the user message. So we can save this. Let's try again. We click, nothing happens. If we say hi and send the message, now we just deleted the message from the input. We added to the history of the chat. And now we just have to send this message to Google AI so we can have a response. So let's go to the documentation. Remember that the simple example we started with in the previous section can be found in the Gemini API documentation under Kickstart. Make sure to select Web at the top here. And let's remember that we need this script first, going to the HTML right before the script for our main.js file. We can paste that one. And now we need to create the variable for the API key. So let's do that at the top of the JavaScript file. Now we can see we're going to need an API key. So let's click here to go to Google AI Studio. To get started, let's click here to create an API key. Now we can copy the API key and go back to Visual Studio Code. Make sure to replace this by your API key. And then we can import the method we need and copy the first 2 lines of code. So at the top, we're going to import Google Generative AI. Let me put it before the API key. Let me just remove these extra lines at the top. So going back to the documentation, we actually could use the generate content method. However, there is a specific method for this use case, which is going to make things a bit easier. So if we go to text generation, make sure to select Node.js right here. If we scroll down, we can see an example using the generate content method. But if you continue scrolling down, you will find this build an interactive chat section. So here we can see that the method is start chat. And this is the recommended one to build your own interactive chat using Google AI. So let's copy these lines of code starting from here all the way to the end. Now inside the if block, right after we collect the message, we can start running the Google AI code. So let's understand what is going on. We are sending an object with the chat history. So we need to make sure to get the actual history that we have and send in this format. Then we are going to call the send message method with the most recent user message, and then we are going to receive the reply and do something with it. What we have down here is just an example of sending another message. We don't need this part because we're going to be sending messages one at a time. Now here we have the await underlined. This is because we can only use it inside async functions. So let's turn the send message function async. Now for the history, we can go right before we execute this function. Let's remember that in this example, we are not working with a database to store messages. Everything is going to happen in the web browser. So let's create a variable called messages. And we can copy the structure of this object. Now here we can leave the history blank. But the reason why we are creating it outside here is because every time we call this function, we are going to update the history. So now instead of sending it like this, we can replace the whole thing by the messages variable. All right, now we need to send the user message to Google AI. So we know we have this inside user message. So let's replace it right here. And then we just need to wait for the response. Before we save this, let me just check if everything's all right. So we are importing Google Generative AI here. I forgot to delete this part. So we just need the API key, which is stored in this variable. The model is correct. We have an empty messages history. So now let's see if we can send this and receive a response. So let's say something like, I need help with an order. Let me open the inspector and send the message. Now we need to wait a few seconds and we can see the answer from Google AI. The more details you provide, the better I can assist you. To improve the user experience, it would be good to have a loader while we are waiting for a response, but let's work on that later. First, we need to show this message to the user. So let me break a few lines and let's remember that we already created something similar at the top here. So we can reuse this code. The only difference is that now this is going to be a message sent by the model. And what we are going to show inside is going to be the content of the message. Another thing we need to do is to update the history. So we can do messages dot history dot push. Now let's remember how we needed it to be. So every message is going to be an object like this. First, the user message. And we are also going to push one for the response, which is going to be a model message. Now we don't need the console.log anymore because if everything works correctly, we are going to see the reply showing inside the chat. So let's just make a quick recap of what we did. We send a request to Google AI, wait for it. When we receive it, first, we are going to show the response inside the chat by inserting this HTML. Remember to be careful when doing this in real-life applications. Then we push both the user and the response to the history so we have it when we need to send more messages. So let's save this. And one thing I'm going to do to test this out is right when we execute this method at the top, I'm going to send the history to the console to see if this is working correctly. So let's send the content of the messages variable. All right, let's try again. We can see we have an empty array. Let's wait for the response. So now we receive the answer. This is a bit big. Of course, we are going to have to configure these messages a bit better, but we can see this is really cool. We have made some good progress in sending and receiving messages. And of course, we need to feed the model with the actual business information so we have more precise answers. But before we work on that, we need to do some error handling. This is because if we have any problems with the API request, the user is not going to know about it. And the Google AI API, especially Gemini Flash, is indeed sometimes unavailable or overloaded. But to make sure we are going to see an error this time, let me simulate a problem by sending a wrong API key. So I'm going to add an underscore at the start, save this, and I'm going to try to send the message. So let's say something like, I need to return a product. We're going to click send. The message shows here, and as you can see, there's an error. Nothing is going to happen after this, but the user has no idea that this is not working anymore. And this is not good. So what we're going to do here is the following. Let's remember that first we are testing if we have a message. If we do, then we are going to start the work. And this is where we are going to use a try catch. So we can let the user know in case this doesn't work. So we can copy all this all the way to the end. So we only have the if statement and the try catch block. We are going to paste all that code inside the try. So now if there is a problem, we can copy this piece of code and we can insert a new div. Let's pick a different class for this. So for example, error, and we can type something like the message could not be sent. Please try again. In a real life situation, we could customize this message depending on the error, but for this example, this is more than we need. So another important thing is that if we have an error here, we're also not going to update the history, which is the correct thing to do, in my opinion, because the last message could not be sent anyway. All right, so let's save this. Let's check it out. I'm just going to type test this time. I'm going to send the message. And now, as you can see, this is much better because at least the user knows that there is something wrong here. We just need to style this a bit better. So let's go to the style.css file. Let's remember that inside the chat element, we have the paragraphs. Here you can see that the error element does not have the same padding. This is because we set individually to the model and the user classes. We didn't have to do that. So I'm just going to set it here to all the piece, and we can remove this one and remove this one. We save this, and now we see this aligned with the other messages. Now we just need to add another selector for the error. Let's make it a bit smaller. So font size, I think 14 pixels is going to be all right. Now this is better. I'm also going to centralize this so this doesn't get mixed with neither the user or the system message. So text align center. And let's change the color to, for this example, red is going to be fine. So this is how this is going to appear in case there are errors. So this is much better. Let's refresh the page. Let's try again. So I'm going to send a test. We tried to send it. There's an error and the user knows that this is not working. So let me send another one. Test. We can see that we are having multiple errors. So at this point, the user will know that he should try again later. Alright, so this is cool. We can go back to the JavaScript file. Let's remove the underline from the API key. So this part is done. Now we can go ahead and start feeding the model with the actual business information so we can start receiving more precise answers. For this, let's use ChatGPT so we can simulate some business data. So I'm going to type, I need to train an AI model to be my chat assistant. I need specific business information, including opening hours, phone, email, return policies, and everything else you find relevant for this example. We have a website as well as 2 physical locations in Madrid and New York, each of them with their own phone, email, and opening hours. Alright, so this is just so we can have something detailed that we can test. If you're doing this for a real company, it's also good to use ChatGPT to help you craft the instructions. So you are going to feed it with as much information as you can about the business and let ChatGPT help you write comprehensive instructions for your AI assistant. So let's type enter. Let's see what we have. I just mistyped a few things, but that's okay. Now let's also ask it for some FAQs and instructions for the tone. So I'm going to add slightly formal and preferably short messages. This is to avoid those long messages that we were seeing at the chat. So while ChatGPT crafts this part, let's copy the whole thing here. Go back to the JavaScript file, and at the top, I'm going to create a variable with the business information. Let's use the backticks so we can have multiple lines, and this is going to be more readable. Let me just delete this part. So we have the general business information, we have the return policy, support email, Madrid location, New York location, and let's see what else we have here. So now we have the FAQs and the tone instructions. I'm just going to use all this, but remember that for a real life example, you should take some time to think about this because this is going to define how the chat assistant will behave. So we can go back there and I'm going to add the other answers right here. Let me just leave FAQs and this is enough. So now we have complete business information. So it's time to test if this is better. Let me save this and now we need to find out where do we include this when we call the model. This is something that's not very obvious in the documentation because in this example of the interactive chat, we don't have these instructions. I tried including this as another property of this object with the instructions. It didn't work. So after reading a bit more, I found out that you need to send it as system instructions. So let's go to web. And now we can see that we are going to include these instructions when we create the model. So right after Gemini Flash, which is the model, we are going to add system instructions, and then we can pass on that information. So let's go back there. So right here, we are going to create this new object. So we have the model, and we are also going to send the system instruction. And for this, we are going to use the business info variable. All right, time to test this out. And I'm going to type, I need to return an item. Let's see if it is going to give specific instructions. So we can see that now this is much different. We are taking users to our website, and we are also supplying more information such as items must be returned within 30 days with the original receipt and packaging. And if we go back to ChatGPT, we can see that these were the instructions we sent to the model. So this is really cool. Let's make another test. Let's ask how to contact you via phone. So this is really cool. We are sending the actual email, the phone number for our 2 locations. Now to make the user experience a bit better, let's add a loader so we know when we are waiting for the assistant to respond. So let's go to the HTML file, and right after the first message we have, which is the model message, we are going to add a div with a class of loader. This class is going to serve not only to enter the CSS for the loader, but also to identify this element, because remember we need to remove it before we insert the response sent by the model. But let's do one thing at a time. First, let's add a nice loader for this. Remember that in the previous project we used this CSS loaders website. So I just went inside dots, and I'm going to use this first option. Now let me save this and go into the CSS file. I'm not going to mix this with our main elements. So right after everything else, I'm just going to paste the code for the loader. Remember that we need it to be inside an element with a class of loader, which is exactly what we just did. So we can save this, and now we can see the loader showing. If you want it to be a bit smaller, you can experiment with different widths, like 40 pixels. I think this is looking nicer. If you want to make it lighter, you could change the opacity. So let's try something like 0.4. So you can experiment with this. If you want to make it slower, let's change the animation time from 1 second to 1.5, which is going to be the total time for it to be completed. And when we do this, you can see that now the loader is a bit slower. So I just wanted to show you that you can configure it the way you want it. So this is good enough for this example. Now we need to add it only when we want it. We could have this element always here and just hide and unhide it. But the problem is that, remember, we are appending messages to the end of it. So a better approach is to add this element every time we start a request. So let's remove it from here and let's go to the main.js. So remember that we are only going to do something if the user types something. So right here, we are going to remove the value from the input. We are going to insert the user message. And now this is a very good time to add that element. Let me put it here, and I'm going to copy this code. And instead of adding a user message, I'm going to add a loader. All right, let me copy this first part because we're going to need to select it later. So we are going to do the request. Either we are going to receive a response or we are going to show an error. In both cases, we will need to remove the loader. So let's do this at the end of the function. So inside here, we have an element with a class of loader, and we can just use the remove method from JavaScript. All right, let's see if this is working. Let's type, I need your email address. We send this. And when we receive the response, we remove the loader and display the response to the user. So this is super cool, but actually there is still something that will improve the usability of this chat drastically. And this is, instead of waiting for the complete message, we could simulate as if the assistant were typing by bringing one word at a time. If you're familiar with ChatGPT, Gemini, and other AI systems, you know that this is normally how we receive the answers. We don't have to wait for the whole thing, but the answer comes in chunks. So let's go to the documentation. Under the Gemini API section, inside text generation, we can select Node.js and scroll down. So here we have the simple example of text only. We scroll down a bit more. There's this generate text stream, but this example here is for the generate content method. If we scroll down a bit more, that's the method we are using, the start chat method. And if we scroll down a bit more, we can see how to enable chat streaming. So we can see for this example right here that we're going to receive the message in chunks. And every time we receive one of these chunks, we're going to have to append it to the system message. So let's implement this. I'm going to copy this first block of code. Again, this one is just a repetition with another message, so we only need one of these. The rest at the top here is going to be the same. We're still going to use the start chat method. So let's go back there. Let's remember that once we start the try block, we are going to remove the message from the input and paste it in the chat. We're going to add the loader to the chat, and then we call the model. We're going to need this part, but we're going to replace the result part. So I'm going to select everything all the way until the end of the try block, and I'm going to hit Ctrl+Shift+7 to comment all this because we're going to need to reuse some of this code. So for now, I'm just going to paste the code we got from the documentation. Now let's adjust the data here. So we have chat.sendMessageStream. We can see it's a different method. The one we were using before was called sendMessage. And here we are going to pass the user message instead of this hard-coded string. Now the rest here is good, so we are going to await for each of the chunks, and then we can just use console.log here just so we can see how this is working for now. Now we are going to try that out. How can I return a product? Let's send this. There was an error. Let's see what it is. So we can see that the service is unavailable. The status is 503. This is probably a problem with the Google AI servers. So one thing you can try here, instead of using the Flash model, you can change it to Pro, which is going to expire much faster the amount of free credits you have. But for this example, this usually works. So I'm going to send this to Pro. Let me refresh the page and try again. Now we need to pay attention to the console, so let me remove it from here. I'm going to put it at the side, and I'm going to ask the question again, and let's see if we're going to receive it in parts. All right, sending this. Now we can see that we received this message in 3 parts. In small messages like this, it might not make that big of a difference, but in long messages, this is going to make a lot of difference because very, very quickly, we are going to receive the first part of the message, and the user is going to have this impression of typing. So now that we know how this works, we can go ahead and implement it inside the model message instead of sending it to the console. So right here, let's remember that this is what we were doing. So we are going to copy all this. And before we run the loop, we're going to create the HTML element. You're going to understand why we're doing this before in a second. First, let me just uncomment the whole thing. So here we are going to create that chat element with a P, but instead of pasting the response.text like this, we're going to be adding it while we receive the messages. So right inside here, let's select that element using document.querySelector all, and then we are going to look for chatWindow.chat. Let's remember the structure. Remember we have a div with a class of model and a P inside. So first, let's just select all divs with a class of model. So this way, we're going to get all the messages sent by the model. Now we just need the last one. So for that, let's just place it inside a variable. Model messages. Let me increase the window size so we can see the code better. So we are going to create this variable, which is going to hold an array with all the messages sent by the model. Now right here, we are going to get the last element of this array. And we know we can easily do this in JavaScript if, as an index, we use the length of model messages -1. So no matter how many model messages we have, we are always going to select the last one. Now inside here, we need to select the P element. So let's just get query selector, because in this case, we just want the first P, or in this case, the only P we have inside. So query selector, let's get the P inside, and we can use this same method. So we are going to add something inside these P's, but instead, what we are going to add is the chunk text. Let's not forget to add it inside $ curly braces, so we can add the dynamic value, and don't forget to leave it inside the back ticks. So like this, we're going to be adding these chunks to that HTML element. So let's see how this looks now. Let me save this, go back there. Now let's ask something like, where are your physical store locations? How can I contact them? Let's see if we can get a longer message. I'm going to send this. Now we see the loader, and you can see that we go adding the chunks received by the model, and this gives a very nice touch to the chat experience. Now our chat looks much better. So remember that we are not going to use send message anymore, but send message stream. So we can delete this. This one we can also delete. And let's remember that we still need to put the history back. So selecting this, Control-Shift-7 or Command-Shift-7 on Mac, we bring it back. This is just going to have to be a bit different because we don't have a response.txt anymore. We receive this in chunks. So in this case, I think the easiest way is to just select this P and get everything we have inside of it. To do this, we're going to have to create this variable outside the for loop, because remember that the let has a local scope inside a code block, like if or a loop. So we need to create it outside here. Then inside, we just call that variable, and now we are going to be able to access it from here. So we are going to get the P element we have inside of it. Let's do exactly what we have here. So we get the last system message, we get the P element inside, and whatever we have inside of it. So let's use the inner HTML. I'm just going to make it full screen so you have a better visibility of the full code. So here we are using the content of that P to form the history. All right, let's give it a try. Let me bring the inspector, refresh the page just in case, go to the console. Let's ask for the phone numbers. So now we see the stream message. Let's see if the history is working fine. So I'm going to send another message. Do you have a store in Paris? And now we can see that the history has been updated. So if we open up the last message, this is going to be the response from the model, which is really cool. All right, now let's just add the functionality to open and close the chat. So for that, let's go back to the HTML, and right after the chat window, I'm going to create an element for the chat button. Now inside here, we can type chat. We can see the element showing right here at the top left of the screen. So let's go to the CSS file. Here we have the chat window. Let's open one selector for the chat button. So this is going to be absolute as well. For now, let's make it show at the top of the chat window and then we can switch. So let me use a Z index of 999 for this and the Z index of 998 for the chat window. We can see the button showing right here. Now let me add a background color. Let me get the same one that I used for the close button. So I'm going to add a variable for this. Now down here, let's use the variable instead. And the same thing for the chat button. Cool. Now let's add some fixed height and widths. I think 80 pixels is going to be all right. And let's make it round by adding the border radius to 100%. Now here, let's change the color to white. And let's centralize the text with flex. I'm also going to add a cursor pointer so we can see this is a button. I'm going to do the same thing for the close button and the same thing for the send button. So now this is going to be a bit better, but now what we're going to have is the opposite. We're going to have the chat button at 998 and the chat window at 999. So we can do it like this. We just need to set a white background for this element. And now, once we open the chat, it is going to show in front of that button. So let's set up these functions. First, we need to go to the index.html. And a nice way to do this is the following. If we have a class of chat open, then we are going to show the chat. So here we can add a selector for the body when it has a class of chat open. And in this case, we are going to show the chat window. So here we are going to set the display to flex. And down here, we are going to change it to none. I like putting this at the top so we can see this better. So we can save this. We are seeing the chat because we added the class. When we remove the class, we are going to see just the button. So now this is going to be really easy. We just have to add and remove this class. Let's make it real quick with JavaScript. But remember, we can't do it from here. I can't add the onClick to the chat button from the HTML because this is a module. So we need to do it from inside the JavaScript file. So down here, remember we did it once for the send button. Now we are going to do one for the chat button. And once we click it, let's run a function right here. So we are going to get the body. Let's get the class list and add a class of chat open. All right, now let's do something similar for the close button. Remember that this one is inside the chat window and it's a button with a class of close. So chat window, a button with a class of close. So one space here, no space here. And this time we are going to remove the class. Saving this, we click the button, we open up the chat, we click the close button, we close the chat. So this is something that can be implemented on any web page. Since we are using absolute positions, this is going to be placed in front of the content. Now just one little improvement here. Instead of using the text like this, let's add a nice icon. So again, you can go ahead and download the chat icon that I left in the description of this video and paste it in your projects folder. Now we can go to the HTML. Let's copy this image from here. Instead of writing chat, we can change it to the chat icon. We save this. Now this is a bit too big. So let's go to the CSS. Let's add a selector for the image and change the width to maybe 50 pixels is gonna be okay. Now this is looking much better. Let me get the box shadow that we have for the chat window and let's include it in the buttons when we hover over them. This is gonna give a nice touch as well. Let's not forget the end right here because we are using nesting. So we are going to do this for the chat button and also for the send button we have inside. We're going to see in a moment how this is going to look. So right here, we save this and now we have the final version. So once we hover over it, we have this nice box shadow. We can open up the chat. We also have a little box shadow in the send button. We can close the window. So now we are officially done with this project. Alright, so that was it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more videos about generative AI in web apps, please make sure to leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Web Schools so you don't miss out on our next videos. So that was all for today. I'll see you next time.